Hello and welcome to this short bite-sized recording titled Using EHCP Outcomes to Drive Meaningful Target Settings for SEND Students. My name is Peter Monaghan, and in this session we'll explore how to transform EHCP outcomes into clear, smart targets that support student success. So whether you're a seasoned professional, new to education, or a Senko, you'll be familiar with the different formats that EHCPs are formatted in. You'll also be familiar with the outdated outcomes that we can get in some EHCPs, and this can be quite confusing because it generally doesn't represent the young person that's in your class. So hopefully this recording will explore how to transform the outcomes outlined in an EHCP into actionable, measurable targets that support SEND students to reach their full potential and their aspirations as well. We'll learn how to develop smart targets that are aligned with individual needs and aspirations, ensuring that each student's EHCP is not just a document, but a dynamic roadmap for their journey to success. So from this presentation, hopefully you'll gain a deeper understanding of the EHCP process and how it can be used to inform target setting. We'll look at clear strategies for creating smart targets that are tailored to the strengths and needs of your learners. We'll discuss some tools to measure and track progress effectively, so ensuring that targets remain meaningful and impactful. And then finally, we'll look at some real-life case studies as well. So some successful case studies that have been used in a variety of settings. So as a quick overview, during this next 10 minutes, we look at understanding an EHCP, how to create smart targets, and then finally, we look at tools to measure and track progress. So what is an EHCP? So if we look at this through the educational lens, and I've used the definition here from the Council for Disabled Children. So an EHCP or an EHC plan is a legal document which describes a child or young person aged up to 25 special educational needs, the support they need, and the outcomes they would like to achieve. If we look at the SEND Code of Practice, and then the SEND Code of Practice defines the purpose of an EHCP is to make special educational provisions to meet the special educational needs of the child or young person to secure the best possible outcomes for them across education, health and social care as they get older, and to prepare them for adulthood. And that's really important because it's one of the key factors that you should consider when you're setting targets or when you're educating a young person with an additional need, is that preparation for adulthood and how that fits in to the education and support that you're going to provide. So if you're new to education or you've had limited experience with looking through an EHCP, what you may not know is that each different local authority has its own separate format. So if you work for a trust or you work for a provider that has multiple sites across different local authorities, then chances are you will see a lot of different formats from young people with an EHCP from different local authorities. So there's 11 sections within an EHCP, but section H is split into two. So the sections are grouped generally into four categories, which are commonly referred to as the golden thread. So the four different categories are the aspirations, which section A sits in, the needs section, which is sections B, C and D, the outcomes section, which is section E, and the provision. So that in the provision section, we have section F, which is the legal part of the document, G and H. So in terms of target setting, we're going to focus specifically on section E of the EHCP, and this is where you will find the outcomes. So the outcomes describe what a student should achieve by the end of the EHCP period. Now it's really important to remember that during an academic year, what you will want to do is try and evidence progress towards that outcome. So an EHCP can last for a number of years. So don't try and achieve all of those outcomes within one academic year because it's unachievable. Also, the outcomes are a key for guiding interventions and teaching approaches. So whenever you're planning your schemes of learning or you're planning your specific sessions, refer to section E and that for the outcomes. Also section F can be useful as well for those interventions. Outcomes should be realistic, aspirational and measurable. You've got to remember when we're setting targets that we want our young people to achieve those outcomes. We want them to be motivated to achieve them as well. So therefore it's really important that we make them realistic, and they've also got to be aspirational. So if we look at section A in the aspirations part of the EHCP, Generally, if it's up to date, that'll tell you what that young person wants to achieve within their time with you. But if the plan hasn't been reviewed yet, and then what the section A will do, even on an old plan, is give you a little bit of guidance of what that young person wanted to achieve before they come to your provider. And you can see at the bottom here, I've just put in a really basic example of an outcome from a plan. So it's to improve communication skills to engage in small group discussions. So SMART targets have been around since the dawn of time, and they're used in education and a variety of different industries such as business. But in terms of using SMART targets for EHCP outcomes, they're essential for turning the EHCP outcomes into actionable steps that can drive student progress and motivation. So in terms of the specific part, what we need to focus on is what exactly do you want the student to achieve? For measurable, how will it be tracked? In terms of achievable, is the target realistic given the student's current abilities and the availability of resources and staff? In terms of relevant, so does the target align with the student's overall learning needs and aspirations? Now, this is really important. So earlier on when we're talking about maintaining that student motivation, so again, it's got to be relevant and it's got to be linked to their aspirations. And then finally, time bound. So what is the time frame for achieving the target? It's also important to put in milestones in terms of as you're progressing through these SMART targets. So in terms of aligning EHCP outcomes with SMART targets, I've put on the slide here a basic outcome in SMART target, and I'm just going to break that down for you. So if we start from the beginning, we've gone to section E of the EHCP, and that's where we've seen the outcomes. We've also had a brief look at section A because that'll tell us the aspirations. Sections B, C, and D will tell us the needs. And then section F will tell us the provision that the local authority has put in place, obviously in collaboration with healthcare professionals, the young person and their caregivers. So the example here is to improve reading skills. So if we look at that from a SMART target perspective, so in terms of it being specific, we want the young person to read simple words aloud with 80% accuracy. So this can either be done in a class or group setting, or it could be done in a tutorial setting if they weren't confident enough yet to read words out aloud within the group setting. But obviously, if we wanted that young person to read those words out within that group setting, that would help prepare them towards that PFA framework as we're preparing them for adulthood. So in terms of it being measurable, we're going to track progress with reading assessments every 2 weeks. So again, we can either do this in class or we can do it one-to-one in tutorials. So moving on, we're going to provide daily reading practice. So again, we're wanting to keep that motivation. We're wanting to keep that young person inspired to improve and enhance their reading skills. So to do that, we have to put in that support around that young person that's going to help encourage and motivate them. Next, we're going to focus on age-related appropriate material. I would also add in there as well vocational related appropriate material. So for example, if our young person wants to be a bricklayer, for example, then you would use material that they would be motivated and interested and inspired to read around that vocational aspiration that they have in terms of employment. And then in terms of being time bound, remember what I said earlier on, we do not need to achieve every single outcome that is in the plan. What we want to do is evidence progress towards achieving those outcomes. So in terms of this example here, we're going to achieve it by the end of the term. So we're going to look at now some practical tips for setting SMART targets and just some considerations to think about when you're setting these SMART targets. So all targets should be student-centered, focused on the individual needs. So remember, we need to keep that motivation. We need to keep that young person interested in achieving progress towards their outcomes, but also progress towards achieving their targets. So what we want to do is make sure that everything we've put in place is individualized to that young person, because generic targets for everybody just won't work. You won't get the same buy-in, you won't get the same motivation for them either. We also need to involve the student and their caregivers in the process to ensure that targets are meaningful. So What we find is that the more buy-in we get from caregivers, so that sort of holistic picture outside of the educational setting as well, helps that young person in terms of support and also motivation as well to achieve those outcomes and the targets that we're setting. Finally, use clear, accessible language in the targets. So what we don't want to do is use overcomplicated language that that young person just isn't going to understand, because if they don't understand something, you're not going to get the motivation or the buy-in. But it's also making sure that the language is clear enough for other staff to understand. So now we're going to look at measuring and tracking performance. So there's a lot of considerations that we can use when we're measuring and tracking performance. And one of the key bits of information that we can use is an EHCP. So that EHCP, depending on how long that young person has had the plan for, really is a history and a catalogue of all of the aspirations, so the needs and the wants of that young person, all the provision that's been put in place with a variety of healthcare and educational professionals feeding into that, but also will give us a sort of good overview of what that young person wants. So we capturing the voice of the caregivers, but also capturing the voice of the young person. So we can use baseline data to understand the starting point of that young person. So in terms of baseline data, like I've previously said, we can use the EHCP, which is a vital catalogue of history and information. We can also use pupil passports. So if you've got a young person that's transitioning from one provider into another, so let's say from secondary school into post-16, what the post-16 provider should be doing is asking the secondary school SENCO or any support staff is around all the information that they have on that young person in terms of the support that's been put in place for them. So pupil passports are a real good sort of treasure trove of support and exam access arrangements, previous targets that have been put in place for that young person. We also break down larger goals into smaller, more manageable and tangible milestones. So in the previous slide, I was talking about using accessible language, keeping language simple. We do the same thing with targets as well. Keep them simple. Don't overcomplicate something, because if you overcomplicate a target, you're at risk of setting that young person up to fail. And of course, if they fail achieving that target, and then that's going to impact the motivation to want to progress and achieve other targets. Regular reviews and adjustments based on progress. So this is vital. You'll set targets and the young person may struggle. So again, we can adjust those targets. We can change and move where needed in terms of support staff, external support, also technology. We can use technology to help support that young person achieve that goal. But you may also have a situation where you've set a target and it's been too easy. So that young person has achieved that target in a quarter of the time that you've set. So again, it will be similar to setting those stretch and challenge activities within your lesson. We will just put an extension on that target just so it's more challenging but motivational for that young person. So in terms of tools, you can use progress charts, tracking sheets, observation logs, or you may have software packages within your educational facility, such as the Pro Suite, which is quite useful for monitoring and recording progress. So we're going to finish off with a real life case study example. So we have a learner here who in her EHCP had a particular outcome to improve social interaction in group settings. Now for this young person, this outcome was quite challenging. She had anxiety, and her anxiety was brought on from her hearing impairment, so she really struggled to engage with her peers, and she really struggled to comprehend what people were saying in a busy group environment. So if more than one people were talking at the same time, she struggled to interpret and understand what was being said. So this was quite challenging both for us and for this young person, because she had an aspiration. So in section A, her aspiration was that she wanted to work, but she wanted to work in the catering industry. So myself and a number of teachers, we worked together and we looked at setting a specific SMART target based on this particular outcome. So in terms of it being specific, we asked this young person to initiate one conversation with a peer during class. Now, at first, she found this really challenging, because even though she'd been in class with the same people for a number of years, because of her anxiety around a hearing impairment, she hadn't really spoken or got to know many of the people in class. So after a number of weeks, you could see the confidence and you could see this young person absolutely thrive as she was initiating those conversations. But what was happening is she was making conversation, people were talking back to her, and again, that helped develop and build on her preparation for adulthood. So in terms of it being measurable, so teachers would just make little observation notes, either on their lesson plans and schemes of learning, but also on the electronic system that we use. They would just set little comments which would relate to the progress that this learner was making. So in terms of it being achievable, we set up little role-playing scenarios because we knew from section A and from conversations with the young person and our caregivers that she wanted to work, and she wanted to work in a cafe. So again, we set up little role-play scenarios first off in class, and then we moved into our own cafe setting where she'd done some work experience in there as well. So that moves on nicely to it being relevant. So the focus was on interactions in structured familiar settings. So as I said previously, it was a classroom setting, then it moved into the cafe area of which this learner was familiar with, because obviously that's where she'd been going to eat. But now that she was doing work experience there, it was helping build that confidence and the setting was becoming more familiar to her. And then in terms of being time bound, so I've put here that it was achieved by the end of the second term. It was, but we also rolled this over into the third term, and we just made it a little bit more challenging by allowing this young person to continue that work experience, but we reduced that level of support that that young person had, and then she was going into the work experience setting by herself. So this is a real success story for us because by the end of that academic year, that young person actually applied for a job, a part-time job in our cafe, and got it. So again, a lot of that was down to the work that was done throughout that academic year of staff going in, looking at the EHCP, identifying those starting points, collating the information to help form the starting point through initial assessments, pupil passports, and then looking to see what provision needs to be put in place to help make those SMART targets motivational, challenging, with successful outcomes. So in summary, so EHCP outcomes outline what the student needs to achieve in their learning development in that preparation for adulthood. So SMART targets, these change or these turn the outcomes into clear, actionable goals that are specific. So we focus on clear, defined goals. They're measurable, so they're trackable with data or observations. They're achievable, so they're realistic given the student's current abilities. They're relevant, so they're directly related to the student's needs and aspirations. So remember that aspirations bit is key because it's part of that motivation and that willingness. And then they're time bound, so they're set with clear time frames for achievement.